Hey listeners, thanks for dropping in. I'm Christy.
And I'm Melissa, and this is Buried Motives, where we dig deep into the details of some of the most gruesome
Dirtbag murderers. Hey listeners,
Welcome back to Buried Motives.
we're so happy you're joining us.
It's going to be another fabulous day to talk about murder.
It's always a good day to talk about murder.
Yes. And today's case, I've picked one especially because it's Family Violence Awareness Month.
Which is so important to educate ourselves about.
For the signs and for the ramifications of it.
Absolutely, because sometimes it's hard for us to see what's actually happening.
Somebody's life could look perfect from the outside, and we don't know anything about what's actually happening.
Right. Or if you're in that type of relationship, it can be hard for yourself to even recognize those signs and be able to explain it away.
Or sometimes you feel like you're the only one.
Yes.
Today, we're going to take a little break from tradition, though. Usually, we don't talk negatively about the victim. But while researching this case, I found very little that was ever reported to be positive about this victim.
Oh, wow.
So I'm curious if by the time that we're done talking, you'll feel the victim was the dirtbag and the murderer was the victim.
Oh, interesting. You have me intrigued for sure.
You might discover that you have to remind yourself, just like I did, that the victim was a victim. And no matter what kind of person he was still a person. He was once somebody's little boy.
Oh, man. That's one thing I've learned while we've been doing our podcast is things are not always as black and white as we think they might be.
No, not at all. And I'm going to put in a huge disclaimer for today's case that we will be detailing some pretty horrific abuse. The child and sexual abuse is some of the worst that I have ever heard.
Oh, man.
Sometimes I found myself not wanting to include all the details because I just found the abuse too disturbing.
So if this is something that's not for you to listen to today, it's totally okay for you to skip and come join us next week.
Absolutely. This case is well documented through journals and research articles and extensive trial hearings. Most of the descriptions will come in the murderer's own words, and sometimes it's really graphic in nature.
All right, we've been warned.
So on a cold, crisp March morning in 1982, Carl Croft was making his way along River Road just outside of Charleston, Nova Scotia. At a little past 7 in the morning, he was walking to catch his ride to work. The road was a muddy mess, and it made driving on it difficult, much less walking. As he walked, he could see a gray half-ton truck on the left side of the road in the distance. And he figured it was just someone who hadn't wanted to chance the muddy road farther up and had decided to go it on foot. As he got closer to the truck, though, he noticed an eerily still frame still perched in the truck, leaning against the driver's side door. As his eyes focused on what was in front of him, he began to take in the blood splatter that coated the truck and made it appear like a bomb had gone off inside of it.
No.
It was very clear to him as he ran to the closest neighbor for help that whoever was inside of the truck was no longer alive.
Oh my goodness, how terrifying to come upon something like that.
Totally not expecting it on your way to work, right?
No.
Yeah.
And that much blood, I'm guessing maybe a gunshot wound?
Police arrived on the scene at 7:35 a.m. and began their investigation. A single male occupant of the truck had been shot at close range with what police guessed to be a shotgun because there was a fibrous wad and slug fragments that were present in the truck. There was no signs of a struggle, and the bullet fragments found indicated that only one shot had been fired.
Whoa. So that would probably indicate that the shooter was close range.
Absolutely. The shot had entered in front of the left ear, and the force of the bullet had caused a pulpification of most of the brain.
Oh.
The force was so powerful, it had decapitated the poor man.
What? I've never heard that before.
And that's why there is so much blood and brain matter all over the inside of the truck.
So they had to have been using a super powerful gun of some sort.
That's what it appeared to be. Being a small town, it didn't take the police long to identify who their victim was. They used the truck's license plate to confirm their suspicion, but it was just a formality. They knew that the deceased was Billy Stafford, a man that they all had at least a knowledge of. He was a long-term resident of the area and lived only 16 kilometers, or about 10 miles, up River Road in Bangs Falls. Lamont William Stafford had been born on February 13, 1941. His family called him Billy to distinguish him from his father, who had the same name. Later, he would claim that he had been born on Friday the 13th and that it gave him power. But it was actually a Thursday that he came into the world.
Oh.
He was the second oldest of the 6 children of Lamont and Winnie Stafford. They had 5 biological children and 1 adopted son. Billy's father made a comfortable living for his family running his own junkyard in Liverpool's Upper End. Billy had a very strong personality and even as a child displayed a passionate dislike for authority and had violent tendencies. Billy had a strict upbringing and didn't appreciate his parents exercising authority over him and telling him what to do. He believed that he should be his own ruler and a ruler over everyone else too. As he grew, Billy developed a belief that he was a powerful man and one that was entitled to his wants and his desires because he was sent by the devil.
Whoa.
There were times when he was in a rage that he claimed he was the devil. The abuse of Billy's later childhood wasn't inflicted on him, but by him. His parents often received blows at his hands when they tried to enforce their rules upon him.
So a little terror right from the start. Whoa.
Acquaintances from his teenage years said that Billy was always sadistic and enjoyed inflicting pain on others. Anyone that displayed any sort of weakness would be at Billy's mercy. Most people gave Billy a wide berth, but he wasn't without charm. There were people that he showed some affection to, and he could maintain appearances if required. It seemed that Billy possessed just enough charisma to lure people in so that they would get within striking distance, like any true predator.
He sounds terrifying already. Just a master manipulator, a total narcissist. And it sounds like maybe something in his brain isn't firing right.
No, and I really struggled to find any positive things that anybody said about him. There were some reports he had helped out some younger boys, but really when you dug into the story, it sounded like he more manipulated them into selling drugs for him.
Oh my goodness. And I'm sure you'll get into this, but was he ever classified as like a sociopath or?
He never had any treatment at all.
What? Oh man.
But there are some comments from his murderer later on about him being a sociopath.
All right. That's what I'm thinking right now, but I'm not an expert.
There are several signs that point that way. So along with Billy's belief that the devil guided him, he also felt strongly influenced by astrology, and his moods were strongly influenced by his daily horoscopes. If a horoscope was favorable, Billy would claim that the devil had his back that day. If it took a negative view, Billy believed that it would be a good day to lay low. And so he would live his life by his horoscopes.
That's definitely an extreme, and it becomes like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because if you believe you're going to have a good day, you can have a good day.
So on the days where Billy felt that he had to lay low, he was particularly surly with anyone who crossed his path. Really, his moods were just so erratic and unpredictable that it might have well have been decided by the stars. Billy was known to fly off the handle with no notice, and anything standing in his way, whether on purpose or not, was in danger. Billy had a particularly tumultuous relationship with the police. Their attempts at enforcing the law and imposing authority over him did not go well. Billy was a law unto himself. His hatred of the police in Queens County was legendary. Police would follow up on deer poaching charges or drug charges, and Billy would threaten them that if they stepped foot on his property, it would be the last time they stepped anywhere.
That is so brazen.
If the police were successful in serving him with subpoenas, Billy would tell them that he would come if he decided to, and it wouldn't be because they summoned him. He would interfere with police investigations and try at every chance to intimidate the police. That's why he was recognized that morning by the police investigating his death.
Oh yeah, he would have totally been on their radar. And this makes sense with what you just told us about how he hated rules. Yeah, so it makes sense that he wouldn't want to abide by any of the laws and listen to the local authorities.
Yeah. Police investigated the crime scene and found that the keys for the truck were still in the ignition. Outside on the ground near the driver's side door, there was a bit of brain matter and fragments of a set of his false teeth.
Whoa.
As the inside of the truck was processed, one thing became very clear very quickly. With no gun found in the truck, it was apparent that Billy's death was not a suicide. Police knew that there would be a long list of suspects that would have wanted Billy dead.
Oh, I can only imagine. Because he doesn't sound like a very class act.
No, but you have to keep reminding yourself that he's the victim.
It's true.
Staff Sergeant Peter Wilson later admitted that when he had heard that it was Billy who was dead, he thought it couldn't have happened to a better guy.
Whoa, he admitted that? That's something that you would think, but not actually say out loud.
No, he said it out loud. Billy was known for terrorizing his neighbors. He once drove straight at a woman pushing her baby in a stroller, playing chicken just for the fun of terrifying the woman.
What?
He only swerved at the last possible moment, just barely missing them.
Oh my goodness. What is it with you and doing cases with men going after women pushing strollers? I just remember you talking about that in another case.
Yep. Well, Billy did it too. He also killed a neighbor's cow by sticking a shovel up its rectum, again, just for fun.
Oh my goodness.
Mm-hmm.
What a dirtbag.
But remember, Christy, he's the victim.
Okay.
I told you might be questioning.
Well, victims can be dirtbags.
Yeah, it's true. So the police called the K-9 unit to search for the missing weapon and then made their way to break the news to Billy's next of kin. So as they drove closer to his house, Billy's wife actually came out of their neighbor Margaret's house. When they asked her when she had last seen Billy and if she could describe what he was wearing, her answers matched what they had found on the side of River Road. When they told her that her partner was dead, she fainted right there in front of them. Jane Marie Hurshman had met Billy when she was trying to get out of her first neglectful marriage. Jane propositioned Billy to have an affair with her.
What?
That way her first husband, Milford, or Milfy, why not, 9 years her senior, would have legal grounds to have a judge grant a divorce that she so desperately wanted. At that time, a husband needed to have a reason to leave his wife. A wife needed a husband to have a reason to set her aside.
Oh, so she was just wanting out and this was her way to do it. It's so sad that that's how the laws were then.
And we'll get into talking about that a little bit, about how this system actually perpetuated family violence. At the time that Jane met Billy, the social fabric of the courts was to keep families together regardless of the circumstances. In theory, it was viewed as being protective to the family unit, but in reality, it often perpetuated cycles of abuse because the means to leave a relationship was often made very difficult.
Oh yeah, because if you're living with an abuser and you have to go and cheat on him or her to be able to leave that relationship, what is that going to do to the abuse? It's going to escalate it.
And at the time, the disparity between men and women's rights was still a canyon. And so men had so many more rights in the court system than women did.
So crazy to me.
It's hard to think that we've come as far as we have since then.
And it's not like that's that long ago. We're not talking about the 1800s here.
No. Jane had married Milfy on April 24th, 1965 at the age of 16 because she had become pregnant with his child. Both Milfy and she thought that it was the proper thing to do. Milfy's extended family were quite involved with their marriage. The newlyweds had moved in with Milfy's grandparents, and despite him being a grown man and having a wife of his own, Milfy's grandmother continued to wait on him hand and foot.
Such a grandmotherly thing to do.
It was, but it was to the extreme. She wouldn't allow Jane to have any control over any of the domestic kind of chores or anything like that.
Yeah, I've always thought it's just never a good idea to live with your in-laws when you're first married, especially.
Well, and I'm sure that his grandmother didn't mean any malice by it. She was 16 at the time. She probably didn't think that she knew anything.
That's true. And she was technically a child, and so she was treating her as such.
Yeah.
Not saying that's right or wrong.
No. But Milfy's sense of entitlement led him to believe that the world revolved around him because his grandmother just always took care of him and did whatever he wanted. He just believed that that's what everybody else should do too. As Jane progressed through her pregnancy in his grandparents' home, Milfy continued to go out and paid very little attention to Jane. With Milfy's grandmother taking care of all the domestic chores, Jane believed that her only purpose in the marriage was to provide sex for him.
Oh, that is really sad.
But that was the lesson that she was learning from the situation that she was in.
And it is that time. Like you talking about the grandma, she would have felt like that was her duty. It was more so about what's a woman's duty than who she actually is as a person and what she can bring to the table.
Right. On October 9, 1965, Jane gave birth to her firstborn son at 5 a.m. all by herself. Milfy wasn't there for the birth and didn't come to see his own child. He didn't even bother to pick them up from the hospital. He sent his grandfather instead.
What? Wow, another dirtbag.
Yep. But for Jane, motherhood replaced the sting of neglect from her husband. Her little boy, who she named Alan, became her whole world. Despite their troubled and neglectful relationship, she and Milfy went on to have a second son, James, on October 17, 1972. It was a very difficult labor that required Jane to have a blood transfusion, but Milfy couldn't be bothered to help his struggling wife. He was seldom home and often cheated on Jane.
Ugh.
Because of his drinking, he had trouble holding down a job to support his family. At this time, Jane was having a difficult time coping with everything that was going on in her life and turned to stealing to experience a rush and a sense of power.
I could see that.
In 1975, she faced 4 charges for shoplifting.
Ooh. She just needed some type of outlet, though.
Yeah, for her, it almost seemed like it was a way to just have control over something.
Yeah.
And I wonder, too, if it was a way to get attention.
Oh, could be.
Because she was so neglected and just felt lost in her whole world.
Mm-hmm.
With both Milfy and Jane's lack of positive ways to cope with their situation, the marriage continued to deteriorate for the next 3 years until January 1976, when Jane gave Milfy an ultimatum, her and his children, over the alcohol. He picked up a 40-ounce bottle of rum that he had just set on the table and kissed it and said to Jane, "I guess you lose."
Oh, whoa.
The two separated, and Jane pursued a divorce, but was told that she had no grounds for one.
No grounds for one. He's a dirtbag. It's sad that a lot of people don't recognize that emotional abuse is still abuse. He wasn't beating her up, but he was still abusing her.
Yeah. So they had separated, but because she wasn't officially divorced, she wasn't able to get any financial aid to help her establish a new home or provide for her boys while she got on her feet, and they weren't well off to begin with. The general feeling was that if she insisted on leaving her husband, then she was welcome to leave, but don't expect any help. Keeping her boys with her was difficult. She had no way to provide for them, and Milfy used this as leverage against her. At one point, the two had agreed to share custody. Because Alan was in school, he would stay with his dad during the week and then go to Jane's on the weekend. James was to stay with Jane the whole time. Unfortunately, while meeting with a lawyer to better understand her options, Milfy took James and kept her sons from her.
What?
It's actually super sad, but they had a social worker come in and babysit James while she met with a lawyer, and they just let Milfy walk right in and take him.
That's ludicrous. That just blows my mind that this was happening.
Yeah. Milfy took her sons, and these were boys that he had never paid attention to.
Yeah, and who are not going to be as comfortable with him because he's not their primary caregiver.
But Jane couldn't raise any argument about Milfy taking the boys because it was a father's right.
Who literally chose to kiss a bottle of alcohol rather than choose his family. But yeah, okay, he has that right.
Yep. And this is a situation that led Jane to proposition Billy to have an affair with her because she wanted the divorce granted so that then she could get some financial aid and get on her feet and provide a home for her boys.
Makes sense. It's sad, but it makes sense.
Billy was one of Milfy's friends that drank with him often.
Oh, she chose one of his friends?
One of his drinking buddies.
Oh.
She had gotten to know Billy when she had been a designated driver for them on one of their little drinking road trips. Milfy had passed out in the car, and Billy had stayed awake the whole time to keep Jane company. Despite his domineering size compared to her petite frame, he was gentlemanly and engaging. He actually paid attention to her.
But this is part of his manipulative side.
But she doesn't know that.
But often we find that abusers can be so charismatic at the beginning.
Exactly. And that's the game that Billy's playing right now. When Jane pled her case for having an affair, Billy agreed to go along with her elaborate plan. They would have an affair, and then Billy agreed to testify on her behalf at court. Billy's willingness to go along with her plan made Billy Jane's knight in shining armor.
Oh, I bet.
The reason why Jane was so caught up in Billy's act of being a hero that swooped in and saved her can be explained by a few things. Billy did know how to be charming when he wanted to be. He could be charismatic if it suited him, but usually not for extended periods of time.
Yeah, because then those true colors come out.
You can only hide who you truly are for so long, right?
Yep.
Jane also was desperate to get out of the relationship with Milfy, where she was constantly ignored and taken for granted. When Billy started paying attention to Jane, she started to feel seen and important. Another reason that Jane was susceptible might have been her childhood. Jane Marie Hurshman was the second child born in her family to Gladys and Maurice Hurshman in Brooklyn on January 25th, 1949. They owned a larger home, but there was no bathroom or running water. Her father provided for the family adequately enough, first by working at a sawmill, and then later by cooking in the army. He was an army veteran from Korea and ran a strict home. Maurice never beat his children, but his wife was another story. After serving in Vietnam, he drank more heavily, and when they moved to Truro, he began to have irritable, unpredictable mood swings. With these mood swings came the physical abuse to Jane's mother. Jane would watch as her mother took the beatings in silence. She would often gather her two younger sisters, and they would sit in the basement of their home as far away as possible from the arguing and the fighting. The physical abuse would continue for years, only stopping when her mother had an ectopic pregnancy and almost died. The rupture of her fallopian tube had caused a great deal of bleeding, and when Maurice had found his wife passed out and blood-soaked, he'd assumed that it had been from the beating that he had just given her, and it probably did contribute to it. Jane's mother had always said that one day things would improve. Her near-death experience was the catalyst for the day that things would improve. Because he was so afraid of ever losing his wife, he did stop beating her. And so Jane then had this belief that things do eventually get better.
Because he had this rude awakening. But you've now introduced 3 different men into this story, and they're all dirtbags. Are we going to come across any man who's not a dirtbag today?
Not until the very end, really.
Oh, man. And it's just really sad because Jane is growing up to think that this is how just men are. Oh, so sad.
It just gives her an acceptance of the later abuse that she'll suffer.
That men kind of have that right to do it.
Yeah. Because of her father's position in the army, they moved around a lot. And for 3.5 years, they were stationed in Germany. There, Jane excelled academically and athletically, earning competition ribbons and medals for cross-country running. She was a pretty girl with brown hair and was soft-spoken by nature. Despite doing well, Jane struggled to get her father's approval. He scorned her attempts to wear makeup and do her hair up nicely. And at one time, in a drunken stupor, he told her to her face that he hated her.
Oh.
This treatment would have a lasting effect on Jane's psyche. She began to believe that if my own father hates me, then who will ever love me?
Yeah, I was just going to say, insert daddy issues here.
Through her early teens, Jane would seek approval from other boys and men. Her first love was a boy she met in Germany. They dated for 8 months, and the day before her family returned to the U.S., she lost her virginity to him at 15. They promised to write and find each other again, but it wasn't in the cards. Once she returned to the States, she didn't hear from him for a whole year.
Yeah, that would be sad for her.
She was devastated, and that's when she met Milfy.
Oh, man. That's super sad because it would have been this whole romantic thing in her mind. I'm leaving back to America the next day. You know, we're going to consummate our love for one another.
Yeah, this is going to make it lasting.
Yeah.
And then she gets ghosted for over a year.
Right. Where honestly, like, it probably was not going to work out regardless, but that was totally a jerk move. Especially because at that time, there was no internet to be texting or Snapchatting or whatever with each other.
Super sad. And she was totally devastated by it.
Oh, rightfully so.
When Jane returned from Germany, she was behind in school and failed grade 9 in June of 1964.
Oh.
Because Germany's education was just different than ours at the time.
Okay.
But her parents were disappointed with her and just sent her away to live with her paternal grandmother, Grandma Mill, to straighten her out. She was a kind woman, and Jane felt at home staying with her. But Grandma Mill did not like Milfy or approve of Jane dating him. When Grandma Mill found out that the two of them were having sex, she sent Jane to live with her maternal grandparents. Once again, Jane was disposable in a relationship that she had trusted.
Oh, man.
So she just kind of got passed around.
Yeah, she's getting rejected everywhere she turns.
Her own father hates her. She thought she was in love with this boy, and now he's not writing. She goes to live with a grandma who she really bonds with, and then because she doesn't live up to her standards, she just sends her away and ships her off to somebody else.
And in the meantime is now in a relationship with dirtbag Milfy. Yikes.
When Billy entered Jane's life, she was primed to fall for his knight in shining armor routine and for his abuse.
Well, she was probably just so desperate at this point for someone to love her, for someone to take notice.
To Jane, at the time, Billy was striking an imposing man who stood over 6 feet tall and weighed 250 pounds. He was a sea merchant. He was big and burly with crude tattoos. He was an intimidating individual, one that even the police were wary of. He wasn't classically handsome with protruding eyes and thick lips, and his long brown hair was beginning to recede, but Billy tried to make up for it by sporting long sideburns.
He's not conventionally attractive.
No. But to Jane, his looks didn't matter. He was handsome to her. And this, along with his nice guy act, blinded her to his behavior.
And I guess that hairstyle would have been more in at that time.
Right. We're talking 70s. So sideburns were in then.
Yeah.
Billy swept Jane off her feet, constantly telling her that he loved her and making promises to give her a good life. And most importantly, he would protect her from all of the people that had hurt her. He would never turn her away or leave her alone.
Oh, man.
When Jane's divorce became final in May 1976, the two had already been officially together for 5 months. Jane and Billy settled into a bachelor apartment in Liverpool, and Jane was happy with Billy's attention. The two eventually moved into an older home in Charleston, and Billy gave Jane money to fix it up. Billy worked away for 2 weeks at a time on fishing boats. While he was away, Jane got to make their home a beautiful place. And so all of those things that she couldn't do with Milfy, she was now doing with Billy. She was able to create this home and be a housewife, which she reveled in. She was still saddened by not having her boys with her, but Billy supported her through the tough times by telling her that soon Milfy would grow tired of parenting and bring the boys back.
It's likely right.
To help with her sadness and as a companion for when Billy was gone, Jane got a miniature poodle and named it Blue.
Aw.
And this became like her best friend.
Oh, we love our puppies, don't we? Mine is so spoiled.
He is.
But you have one that is now too, so you can't say anything.
When Jane crashed Billy's car by accident, Billy just laughed about it. And Jane was so relieved that her mess up hadn't cost her their relationship, because that had been her experience before, that if she made a mistake, people would leave her or ship her off.
Yeah.
Despite the two never getting officially married, Jane started using Billy's last name and started calling herself Mrs. Jane Stafford. Because she was so happy, when Billy told her to stop taking her birth control, Jane went along with it. She was terrified to have another baby because of her last delivery, but she also wanted Billy to be happy. She was happy that he wanted their children, unlike Milfy, who had never cared about them. But in August 1976, when Jane became pregnant, things didn't go how she thought they would.
Oh, no. I know I've been enjoying this little bit of
reprieve.
Yeah, for her right now. But I know that this isn't how it's going to stay.
No.
Which is so sad.
Prior to starting a relationship with Jane, Billy had been in 2 other serious relationships. At the age of 21, he married Pauline Oikel. She was pregnant with his first child at the time, and like Jane's first marriage, it seemed to be the proper thing to do to get married. 6 years and 5 children later, Pauline was granted a divorce by the courts on the grounds of cruelty.
Whoa, 5 children?
In 6 years.
Whoa.
She was pregnant pretty much every 11 months. The physical abuse started soon after they moved in together. Some beatings were so brutal that Pauline had to be hospitalized.
And that would have been while she was pregnant most of the time, or had just barely given birth.
Oh, absolutely.
Oh.
And Pauline wasn't his only victim. Billy had a very unusual thought process when it came to children. He didn't particularly like them, but he did like that they represented his virility. He would not allow Pauline to take any kind of birth control to keep from getting pregnant. Then he would become angry and violent towards her and the children for their presence.
So it was just like a flex for him. Look at my seed.
That's right.
Ugh.
But really didn't like the children at all.
He's gross.
From the time that his children were 6 months old, Billy started to inflict corporal punishment on them if they cried.
6 months old?
Yeah.
That's how they communicate. I have to keep reminding myself he's the victim. He's the victim. I don't know if I'm going to feel very sorry for him by the end of this, though.
It was really, really hard to have any sort of compassion for him.
And we're not victim blaming, but this is just the story. This is what happened.
He would take his small children and make them sit on the stairs with lit cigarettes in their mouth, and they were not allowed to move until the tobacco had burned away. Then he would force them to eat the cigarette butts, and that would gain them the right to move from the stairs.
What? Did they have to smoke it or just hold it in their teeth?
Just hold it in their mouth until it burned their lips. And then they would have to eat it, and then they could get down from the stairs.
Oh my goodness.
To his second oldest daughter, Billy would force her to stand against the house as he threw knives at her.
What? Did he ever hit her with one of the knives?
I didn't see anything that said that he had actually hit her.
Okay.
But she had to learn to stay very, very still.
How terrifying.
He also caused her to have this lifelong fear of the dark by making her sit outside on a dark porch all by herself through the whole night when she was no more than 4.
That's just so cruel.
Pauline did try to charge him with the abuse that she suffered at his hands, but later dropped those charges when Billy promised he wouldn't do it again.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's going to pan out.
Yeah, it lasted a whole 2 weeks. When she finally was granted a divorce in the spring of 1968, she and her children had deep emotional and physical scars inflicted on them by the man that was supposed to love them. By 1971, Billy was in a common-law relationship with another woman, Faith Hatt. This relationship lasted 2 years. During that time, Faith was frequently beat. Faith later said about Billy's unpredictable behavior that for no apparent reason, he would take hold of me and pound me with his fist. You never knew. He could be good one minute and the next minute snap. He actually frothed at the mouth when he came at me like a mad dog.
Oh,
There were occasions that he beat me when he wasn't drinking, but most of the time it was when he was drinking. And that was frequently reported by all of the women that he was with, that when he was angry, his eyes would bulge out of his head and he would froth at the mouth and like spit and just get so enraged.
like a rabid animal.
Mm-hmm.
He is such a tyrant, and what a terrifying way to live when it's not even anything that you're doing that's going to set him off. Not that anything you would do would justify him in doing that, but to be good 1 minute and then all of a sudden he just starts beating on you.
The unpredictableness of it just led to more terror for these women.
Yeah, you would just always be anxious. You would always be on edge, walking on eggshells.
Mm-hmm. When Faith became pregnant, Billy tried to choke her to death.
Oh.
She was only able to escape his powerful hands because he had been drinking and he was a little bit more clumsy than normal. Faith fled the province and didn't return for 7 years.
Good for her.
Mm-hmm.
So this is now 6 children.
Yep. Billy clearly had a history of increasing his violent tendencies when his partners became pregnant. When Jane became pregnant, his whole demeanor changed towards her. Once loving and supportive, he would now insult her about the weight she gained and her difficulty controlling her bladder. He would say things like, "Can't you control yourself? It ain't bad enough that you're big as a barrel. Now you have to be like a dog."
Oh my goodness.
And these are the things that he would say in public.
I wonder if he was jealous because he's such a narcissist that now that these women are growing these humans inside their bodies and he knows the care and love that they're going to have for this child, I bet he's deep down resentful.
I think that has a large part to play in it.
Yeah.
Billy was no longer attentive, but spent more time drinking and getting high. His substance abuse would just make the verbal abuse even worse. On May 30th, 1977, while Billy was away on the boats, Jane had Billy's father, Lamont, drive her to the hospital. She had grown quite close to Lamont and often visited Billy's parents when he wasn't around. Jane gave birth to her third son, Darren Edward Stafford. Darren was an 8-pound, 9.5-ounce boy, and she again had a very complicated delivery and hemorrhaged really badly. The doctor advised her to have a tubal ligation. 2 days later, when she went in for the procedure, she was almost denied because they said her husband would have to give her permission and sign papers.
Oh, I just hate that that's part of our history. That gets me so riled that your husband has to give permission for you to do what you want with your own body.
And with Billy's history, there's no way he's ever going to allow her to do this. But Jane lied and said that Billy would sign the papers, but he was just out at sea. And so it was best that they just go ahead with the procedure. And then when he got home, she would have him sign the papers. The hospital agreed and proceeded based on the assumption that Billy would sign the papers. That was the only way that they were going to do it.
Yeah.
Billy came to see his new son 4 days after his birth. He didn't ask about him at all, just remarked to Jane, "Well, I guess you got what you wanted. You got your boy. Well, old woman, you better look after him. He's all yours."
He's so terrible. And he's the one who asked her to stop taking birth control.
Yep, she thought he wanted this baby. And that's why she risked her life to have him.
Right. So now we're on baby number 7 for him.
Mm-hmm.
And he doesn't care about any of them.
Not at all. Billy refused to sign the form for tubal ligation and told Jane that it made her no good anymore. He was super angry that she had went ahead. And so as retaliation, she had wanted to go and stay with his parents because she just had a major abdominal surgery.
Yeah.
And he said no, he wouldn't allow her to do that, that she had made her bed to lie in it. You chose to have this surgery, and so now you can look after yourself.
It's too bad she couldn't have just kept that from him.
But she couldn't because back then it was a whole incision.
Right.
And you'll find out as we go through the abuse that she suffers why she couldn't hide that from him. So Jane returned to the house that she had so painstakingly fixed up and made a home, and it was an absolute disaster. Billy had gotten off the boat sooner than he had told her. He had been partying the whole time that she was in the hospital having their son. There was vomit all over the bed from his hangovers, and Billy had chosen to use a bucket in the bedroom instead of going outside to the outhouse in his drunken state.
Ah.
All of this mess was days old and left for her to clean.
When she's coming home with a brand new baby.
And having major abdominal surgery.
Oh my gosh.
Mm-hmm.
What a disgusting human being.
It's really hard to keep looking at him as the victim.
Well, right now he's not.
No.
Like, he is just a full-blown dirtbag, abuser, vile little weasel of a bug.
Just wait. We'll get into even more.
Oh.
So at the time, when Jane returned home, her house didn't have any running water. So to clean, Jane had to draw water from the well and carry the buckets into the house to clean it.
After just having had a baby and tubal ligation.
Yep. And Billy refused to lift a finger to help her. When Billy returned to sea, Jane discussed his change of attitude towards her with his parents. And his mother just brushed it off, saying that Billy just needed time to adjust. And what Jane heard was that things would get better. She just had to stick it out.
Yeah, they're not.
No. When Billy returned from the sea, he demanded sex. He made Jane strip, and then he berated her for her appearance. Jane suffered through the abuse. She believed that this was just a phase. Billy needed time to adjust, and her own mother had faced abuse and endured it in silence, and the beatings had eventually stopped. At the end of August in 1977, Billy and Jane had to move from their home in Charleston to a smaller home in Bangs Falls. The move was another stress in their relationship, and Billy became even more mean. Billy had been blacklisted from the fishing boats at this time because he had been charged with mutiny for fighting and holding a man at knife point. When the RCMP came to the new house to serve him with papers, he chased them out of his house with a loaded automatic rifle.
Whoa.
The police ducked so low trying to hide from him as they drove away, they had to leave the door open to see the road. They couldn't even have their heads up to see out the windshield.
And he wasn't later arrested for this?
No one would testify against him, and all of his charges were dropped. And that was a frequent occurrence for Billy and his criminal dealings. He would be charged, and then witnesses would refuse to testify because they were terrified of retaliation. One time, Billy even persuaded another man to take the fall for him. What Billy wanted, he made sure to get. A few times through charm, but most of the time through force and intimidation.
Which is just teaching him that he can do whatever the heck he wants with no consequence.
Mm-hmm. You have law enforcement officers that are running from him.
Wow. They needed to come back there with the SWAT team and haul his butt to jail.
Yeah. Jane had tried to ease the tension in the home by getting a job at Hillsview Acres County Home in the kitchen and did her best to keep her house in order, but it didn't make much of a difference at all. The physical abuse started when Darren was 6 months old, and I'm not sure why this particular time was a trigger for Billy, but it seems that in all of his relationships, the abuse would always get worse when the babies turned 6 months old.
That's interesting.
When Darren turned 6 months old, Jane had had a beautiful day. It was her day off, and she had taken Darren out to get photos done. She bought KFC home because Billy was putting in cabinets in the kitchen, and there was only a hot plate to cook on.
And if any of our listeners don't know what KFC is, it's fried chicken, and it's awesome.
Yes. Jane knew that Billy and his friend Richard would have worked up an appetite, and she wanted to make sure that Billy had a good meal. Hangry Billy was a situation she liked to avoid.
Hangry anybody is a situation you want to avoid.
After serving the meal and cleaning up and putting Darren to bed, Jane rested on the front porch, taking in the pretty view surrounding their home. She invited Billy to join her. Instead, he grabbed her by the hair and started screaming at her about making eyes at his friend and serving chicken to impress another man. He called her a whore, slapping, kicking, and punching her. The next morning, he promised that it would never happen again.
It's almost like if he sees something beautiful, he has to destroy it. He saw her having a moment of gratitude and appreciation and just enjoying her day, and he had to stomp on it like the monster he is.
Mm-hmm. And it just seemed so out of the blue for Jane. That hadn't been her intention at all. It was the first physical beating that Jane had ever received, and she racked her brain wondering if she had actually looked at Richard. Had she caused the beating?
And the answer is no.
Yeah, of course. It was nothing to do with her at all, and all to do with Billy's jealousy.
And that's part of the awareness that needs to be raised, is it's not your fault. If someone is beating you, that's their choice. That's not because of anything you did to deserve it.
But this is the mentality that Jane believed.
Oh, unfortunately, for most abuse victims, it is.
Yeah. Just to confirm that this was not anything that Jane had done and that it was completely Billy's jealousy, he would beat her every time he invited friends over to their house, even if she stayed in the bedroom and never made an appearance at all.
What?
Mm-hmm.
But then she was still flirting, even though she stayed in the room and didn't even set eyes on them?
Yep. Billy would make things up in his head.
Wow.
Even though Billy was no longer working, he refused to watch Darren, and so Jane had to pay for him to be put into childcare, which in hindsight was a good thing. The neighborly couple that cared for him during the day provided him with stability and love and contributed to his ability to cope with this tragedy later in his life. At 6 months old, Billy refused to let Jane feed Darren at night. Instead, he would go into the room and make the baby boy stop crying. Jane never knew what he actually did to make him stop crying, but Darren learned quickly not to cry at night.
What a monster.
To Billy, the most important lesson Darren could learn was to be tough and to be a man. When he was 2, he beat the boy for crying about an earache. Billy's own mom raised objections, but he just threatened her with a beating and told her to mind her own business.
Well, and he had hit his mom before growing up.
By the time Darren was 3, Billy had taken to getting Jane's attention if she was outside by shooting at her feet with a rifle.
What?
Yeah.
Just in the middle of the neighborhood, I'm just going to shoot at your feet?
Yeah. So their property is a little bit secluded.
Oh, okay.
And so she was outside in the garden, and instead of hollering at her or whatever, he thought it would be funny to shoot at her feet. And by all accounts, he was like this excellent marksman that never missed a target, but he would purposely shoot at her.
Yeah, I don't care how good of a marksman you are. If you don't want to actually shoot somebody, you don't aim your gun and shoot right beside them.
Yeah, but he would do that frequently.
He just wanted to terrorize her.
Oh, absolutely. That was what it was for.
Yeah, and he thought it was hilarious, I'm sure.
During one of these beckons, he told Jane that she had a mess to clean up and directed her into Darren's room. The 3-year-old was lying naked on the bed, covered in blood and feces, trying not to cry.
What?
Billy had beat him with a mop handle for crying. He had beat this little boy so bad that he was covered in blood, and Darren had defecated during the beating.
I just cannot even imagine that horror as a mom.
No.
And that's lasting damage that he's doing to that child.
Another time, Darren would have to receive dental surgery to fix the damage done by Billy's adult fists on his toddler's face.
Oh my goodness, this is so infuriating.
Darren had cried after falling off a chair and putting his teeth through his lip. When Billy had asked him if he had cried about the incident, because he came home later, he didn't even see him do it, Darren answered him truthfully because he knew that if he lied, he would get a beating. So when Darren told him that he had cried, Billy gave him 3 sharp punches to the face, and it broke all his teeth.
Oh my gosh.
At 3.
Like, kids are supposed to cry. Like, this is how they regulate emotion and they learn how to deal with their feelings.
Billy always used violence to teach his son lessons. When Darren was a teeny bit older and had accidentally lost some money that had been given to him, Billy picked him up by his hair and put a butcher knife to his throat. At other times, Billy would hang the small boy from his feet and point a loaded .30-30 rifle at his head.
Melissa, this is heartbreaking. I just cannot even imagine what some children have to live through.
It doesn't make any sense. This little boy was no threat to him at all.
No, he's just doing it for his own enjoyment.
And it's so sad that because there was no predictableness to his dad's outrages, Darren at 3 couldn't understand what behavior he was supposed to display.
He just knew he couldn't cry.
That's right. Sometimes the abuse would come for no reason at all, though. So even when he wasn't crying, the abuse would still come.
I cannot even imagine a poor child having to live that way. And it's really sad that Jane is obviously in this state where she doesn't feel strong enough to leave. Because for us looking from the outside in, we can be judgmental and say, why didn't she leave? Why did she let him treat her son that way? But she had already had her other 2 children taken away by her first husband. She has this glimmer of hope that things will get better because that's what happened for her mom. She just must be in such a state to not be able to leave him.
And she learned really quickly that if she raised any objections to Billy's treatment of Darren, that the abuse just got worse for both Darren and herself.
And probably not a lot of resources for her to go to for help either.
Not at that time, no. Billy couldn't even allow the small mercy of some joy in his son's life. Darren had toys, but was not allowed to play with them in front of Billy. If Darren showed that he liked a particular toy, Billy would give it away or he would destroy it. At Christmas, Billy would open any of the presents Darren had received and place them in a position of taunting and not allow him to play with them. And all of this was done to make sure that Darren knew who was in control.
He's so despicable. Christmas, like you're even going to ruin Christmas.
Absolutely, he did. He controlled the whole opening presents. He opened all the presents. Nobody else opened their presents. Jane and Darren weren't the only ones to suffer at Billy's hands during this time. Billy did find work eventually on and off from 1978 to 1981 on various oil tankers and gypsum boats. In September 1981, Billy brought home a friend to live with them.
Oh, great. So she's going to get beat every day.
Yeah, because there's another man in the house. Ronald Wombolt, or Ronnie, had been left by his wife because of his abusive nature. He was now homeless, and Billy took advantage of this opportunity to abuse his old friend. He allowed him to move in with him and then used him as a slave for chores and a convenient drinking buddy when he needed someone to drink with, which was almost every day.
Yeah.
He would slap him and punch him and make him do all of his chores.
Which is surprising that his friend would put up with that because he's an abuser too.
But it's almost like a hierarchy of dominance.
Billy was the alpha.
Yep.
Wow.
Billy also took to shooting at Ronnie.
This is giving me Michelle No Tech vibes.
Absolutely. He just manipulated even other adult men.
Yeah, because that's exactly what she did. She abused her children, and then she brought all these people into her house and would even murder them.
Ronnie, too, was too scared to raise any objections to Billy's abuse and never thought of going to the police because he felt that they would be of no help.
And he probably felt a little embarrassed, too, to be a grown man being beat by another man. Yeah.
Alan, Jane's oldest son, came to live with his mom when he was kicked out of his father's house and having trouble in school and with the law. While Alan lived with his mom and Billy, his life became just like Ronnie's. He was a servant for Billy and would get slapped and punched to ensure his submissiveness. Billy treated him the same way he would treat Blue and the other family pets.
Aww.
At any time, he would strike out and start beating them. Billy was known to shoot and maim the neighborhood dogs, and he shot at and maimed the people in his house, too. Alan would later recount one particular dinner when Billy had beat them all. Darren wasn't as fast as Billy at eating, and Billy had started to force feed him, causing the little boy to vomit. Billy then started shoveling the vomit back into the boy's mouth.
No.
When Jane spoke up, trying to placate Billy by calling him hun and saying, like, this is not okay, he smashed all the plates on the table, cracking them over Alan's head, and then started to beat Jane with his fist. When she was too weak to fight back or defend the others, he started to beat Darren.
Oh my goodness. Melissa, this is terrible.
I know, I did give you a trigger warning.
You did.
And it wasn't that Billy himself tried to live by a higher standard and expected everybody else to live by the same one. He was a complete slob. He was so lazy that at night he would refuse to get out of bed when he had to urinate. Instead, sometimes he would use a bottle, but other times he would just urinate in the bed, and then he would make Jane change the bedding around him.
So he wouldn't even get off of the bed?
No.
But even just think of the mattress. A grown man's pee all over the mattress. Like, that's going to be a larger amount. How do you even get that all out of there while he's still laying on the bed?
Urinating for him was a way to exert his dominance over everybody.
And just to degrade her.
Billy would beat Jane whether he was drinking or not, but on the nights that he combined alcohol with using acid, those were always the most terrifying nights. During one binge, he strapped Jane to a kitchen chair and held her there at gunpoint for 3 nights. He would release her and send her to work during the day and then retie her again to the chair when she returned. On the last night that he had kept her tied there, he urinated all over her head.
Oh my goodness.
Sometimes when he beat Jane, he would mistakenly call her Pauline, his first wife's name. Some close to Billy said he never got over Pauline leaving him and taking his kids away, and so he would take out his rage then on Jane for that as well. The whole house lived in fear of Billy, too afraid to help each other or stand up for each other. During one of Jane's beatings, Billy had beat her so badly with the butt of a gun that she had been left unconscious on the kitchen floor. Alan had waited until he thought Billy was asleep and then went out to check on his mother, who was still lying deathly still on the kitchen floor. He quietly tried to rouse her and then poured water over her, trying to make her wake up. But when that didn't work, he returned to his bed because he was terrified that Billy would find him trying to help his mom. And so he went to bed, not even knowing if she was still alive.
I can't even imagine that.
The sexual abuse that Jane suffered is one of the worst cases I have ever learned about. It is utterly disturbing. Billy was ritualistic when he returned home from working on the boats. When he got home, he would make Jane strip naked and inspect her body all the time, totally degrading her.
That totally is.
Then he would strap her to a chair with her legs spread wide apart and pluck her pubic hair out one by one.
What?
He would bathe her and cover her in perfume and force her to wear lingerie that he had collected from whatever port he had last visited. He would then tie her up in several positions, and with each new position, he would rape and sodomize her. Over and over again, this would happen. To aid with him entering her anally while he was at home, he would insert a pipe into Jane's rectum and only allow her to remove it when she went to work.
What?
When she was at home, she would have to go about all of her daily chores with this pipe inserted into her rectum.
Oh my gosh. Was his idea to stretch it out?
Yeah, so it wasn't as hard for him to enter her.
I have no words for this guy because what that's damaging inside of her.
She had permanent scars forever.
Yeah.
Bestiality also entered the bedroom.
No.
When he wasn't making Jane parade around the house naked on all fours with a dog leash in front of their children and in front of Ronnie, he would make Jane perform oral sex on their dog and then have sex with it as well.
What?
And there are so many more sexually humiliating and degrading things that he did to her that we couldn't possibly cover them all. And honestly, it's too disturbing to cover them all.
Okay, yeah, I'm not seeing him as a victim, Melissa. I'm not.
It's so hard to see this guy as a victim.
Yeah.
Jane never told her family about any of the abuse she suffered. She feared for their safety, and she didn't believe that it would make any difference at all. So she thought that if she told them, it would just put them at risk.
Well, and they've taught her that if there's anything wrong with you, we're going to ship you away.
Yeah.
They're not there for her.
That does change later on, but that's what she grew up to believe.
Yeah.
The worst part of the abuse was the hopelessness of it all. Because of Billy's manipulative ways, she didn't believe anyone would help her, and she began to believe that all of the abuses that the family suffered at his hands were because of her. It was her fault, and she felt completely alone.
She would have felt an inch tall.
Mm-hmm.
She would have had zero self-esteem, zero self-confidence at this point.
Society at the time didn't help either. Spousal abuse in the courts was given lower priority than an assault of a stranger. At the time that Jane was experiencing abuse at Billy's hands, 20% of homicides in Canada involved spousal slayings. And in 1982, half of the women killed were killed by their spouse or exes.
Wow.
The stats are a little bit better today, but there's still massive room for improvement.
Oh, definitely.
Jane felt constantly threatened. The only time that she was able to let down her guard a little was when she was at work. One day, Jane was loading the wood stove that heated their house. She was busy doing chores while Billy laid in bed. She bent over and a .22 caliber bullet whizzed by her head. Billy just laughed and excused his behavior by saying that if he had wanted to hit her, he wouldn't have missed. And this incident was a turning point for her. She realized that had she even just stood up unexpectedly, it would have hit her.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Like, this is full-blown torture.
Yeah. With this realization that he was going to kill her, she told Billy that she was going to leave him. He laughed and just told her that she could leave at any time, but if she did, he would shoot her family one by one. With that fear, she lost all hope and resigned everything over to Billy. Jane said, "I became a robot and believed that only in death would I find peace." On 2 separate occasions, she had gotten up in the middle of the night while Billy slept and loaded a gun and put it to his head. But she had stopped herself from pulling the trigger because of Darren. She thought about suicide, but again, the thought of leaving Darren stopped her. She couldn't imagine leaving Darren alone with his dad.
Oh, never. He's never taken care of him a day in his whole entire life.
And not just taking care of him, but he does the exact opposite.
Yeah.
And brutally beats him. At Christmas in 1981, Jane contemplated hiring a man to kill Billy for her. She offered an acquaintance $20,000 from a life insurance policy to kill him, but the man turned her down. He was too afraid of Billy.
And rightfully, we shouldn't be, killing people for our friends.
No,
Yeah.
right? And this is where it gets a little sketchy. You feel so bad for Jane, but she's going to these extreme measures. But you kind of understand why.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah. On March 11, 1982, after threatening to kill the neighbor Margaret Jowdry over a dispute of property lines and pigs, Billy threw all the clean laundry that Jane had just finished into the mud and left for town, right after stealing money out of Jane's purse that she had been saving for bills.
So he was mad at his neighbor and took it out on his wife.
Mm-hmm. And she had to haul in water and wash it by hand. They didn't have a laundry machine.
Oh.
And she had just hung it all out to dry, brought it in, and then he threw it all back out in the mud.
Even us with our modern day conveniences with a washing machine, if someone did that after we had just washed and dried and folded a bunch of laundry, we'd be livid.
Yeah. Ronnie went with Billy, and they headed straight for the liquor store and finished almost a whole quart of rum and a joint before returning home for dinner. From their trip in town, they also brought with them a jerry can of gasoline. Margaret was a woman that Jane felt extremely close to and regarded her as a motherly figure. She was the closest neighbor that Jane had, and Jane would often find refuge in her home. Billy demanded that Jane drive him and Ronnie to another friend's house to continue their binge of drinking and smoking pot. Jane dutifully drove them and waited for them to finish and then drove them home around 8:30 p.m. when Billy demanded a ride home.
And what's so infuriating about that too is knowing, like as a wife, if I was sitting outside waiting for my husband to finish his binges, knowing that he's using the money that we needed to pay bills.
Uh-huh.
And he's not going to care. He's going to blame her if the bills don't get paid.
And he's just letting her sit out in the cold. He doesn't care anything about her.
Yeah. You can't come in and join me this evening, but you can sit outside like a servant and wait.
She was his personal chauffeur. On the ride home, he ranted about setting fire to Margaret's home. He laid out his plan to use the gasoline in the jerry can that he had just purchased earlier in the day. Then he laughed, an evil laugh, and said that he would deal with Jane's son Alan too, because Alan had just gotten in trouble. And so he was going to take care of Alan too. He ranted like that until he passed out. When they pulled into their home, Ronnie went inside and passed out as well. Jane stayed in the truck. She was well aware of Billy's rule that she must remain outside until he gave her permission to enter their house. And she wasn't ever supposed to wake him up. She just sat out there in the truck contemplating her life, the abuse that she had suffered, that her boys had suffered, and then she started to think about all the threats that Billy had made that night. She honked the horn to get Alan's attention in the house. Alan was asleep in the house, and it took 2 times to get his attention, but he did come out to the truck. When he approached his mother, through the open driver's window, Jane told her firstborn to get the gun and load it.
Oh my goodness, she's involving her son.
And Alan didn't really question what his mother was asking him to do. It wasn't an unusual request for Billy to tell him to get a loaded gun. He often shot deer out of season, when he wasn't shooting at his mom and the cops, of course.
Sorry, but this is Jane that asked him, right?
Yeah. But he sees Billy in the truck, and he doesn't recognize that Billy's asleep.
Okay.
So Alan didn't really question it. Alan chose a 12-gauge shotgun. When he returned outside, his mother was standing beside the driver's door of the truck, and from his vantage point, he couldn't see Billy. Jane told him to bring her the gun, and then told him to go back in the house. And he did as she asked. As he was inside pacing, he heard a single shot. Within 30 seconds, he was back out the door. Jane was standing by the truck with a gun in her hands. She had shot Billy by putting the barrel of the gun through the driver's window, getting as close to Billy's head as she could, turned her own head away, and pulled the trigger. The Cooey Model 840 12-gauge shotgun with a force of 16,000 feet per second was less than 6 inches away from Billy's head.
Oh.
And that's why he was decapitated by the blow.
Yeah.
The whole time, Billy was asleep. When Alan appeared by her side, she handed him the gun and told him to get her clean clothes and put them in a garbage bag. He obeyed his mom. She then gave him instructions of how to get rid of the gun and call her father for help. He was to tell the neighbors, Margaret and her partner Roger, that they were safe now. Then she climbed into the cab of the truck with her dead husband. She was covered in blood and bodily fluids, but all she could think about was getting the truck and the mess away from where Darren could see it. She drove 7 miles down River Road. The bumps made Billy's torso fall into her as she drove, but she just kept looking straight ahead.
Oh my goodness.
So his dead body is leaning up against her.
With his head shot off.
With the help of the neighbor, Alan dismantled the gun and threw it into the river by their house. Alan then went back home and wiped down the outside of the house where blood and brain matter had splattered against the wall. Jane's parents picked her up after she dropped off the truck along the side of the road. She told them not to ask questions and had them drive to their house so that she could get cleaned up. She walked into their house without allowing them to turn the lights on. And then when done bathing, she asked her dad to take her back home, but not along River Road. So she had him take the back way home.
Or they would have passed the truck with Billy in it.
Once home, she reunited with Alan, who had gone back to Margaret's home. They came up to the house, and all of them tried to calm her down, but Jane was in shock. After the neighbors left and Alan eventually fell asleep on her bed, too afraid to leave her alone, Jane still lay awake. She still feared Billy. Irrationally, she figured because she had left the keys in the ignition that Billy would be able to drive back home and begin to terrorize her again.
Wow. I know we've talked about this before. We talked about it in your Halloween case, but her brain wasn't even able to catch up with what had happened yet.
No, with what she had done.
Yeah.
For the next 2 days, Jane remained in a dazed state with the help of some Valium. But it didn't take police long to target Jane as the prime suspect. Jane had tried to blame the shooting on a mafia hit from a drug deal gone wrong, but the police weren't buying that story. On March 13th, she was brought into the Liverpool detachment for questioning. The interview started at 12:35 a.m. and went until 6:55 in the morning.
Oh, wow.
Jane was slow and acted like she was on tranquilizers, because she was.
Yeah.
Quiet and expressionless, she sat there. She refused a lawyer, but just kept asking to speak to Billy's father. Through all the police tactics, she never confessed. They even told her that everyone else was out celebrating that Billy was dead, and if she confessed, she could go home and celebrate too. One of the interrogating officers was overheard saying that Jane deserved a medal for what she had done. She had likely saved their officers' lives by killing Billy.
Probably.
Around 9:45, after getting to meet with Lamont, Billy's father, and with her own father, she was again interviewed by the police. They started trying to indirectly question her about what had happened, and Lamont, who was allowed to stay with Jane during this interrogation, stood up and defended her. He encouraged the police to stop playing around and just ask her straightforward questions. The police followed Lamont's challenge to just come straight out and ask Jane point blank, "Did you kill Bill?" Jane answered yes. As soon as she had made her peace with Billy's dad, she confessed to the crime. Lamont consoled her during her whole confession. Never once did he seem the least bit upset with the woman who had just killed his son.
Whoa, that speaks volumes as to what kind of person Billy was.
Yeah, when his own dad isn't upset that he's dead.
Yeah, and is consoling the murderer.
It had actually been Lamont who took Jane to the hospital right after Billy's death to get some help because she was so out of it and in shock. And that's when she was prescribed the Valium that had made her dazed and confused during this time that she was being questioned. After her confession, Jane was allowed to go back home to sleep. She awoke only to tell Darren that his father was dead and that he wouldn't be coming home anymore. The young boy, only 5 at the time, asked her if it was true and then said he was glad and asked her if she was glad too.
Wow.
And this is where things get a little strange. Jane Marie Stafford was charged with first-degree murder on March 16, 1982. She wasn't arrested or jailed.
What? They let her just stay home?
Yeah, they actually drove her back home after she confessed to murder.
They really did think she was doing them a favor.
Police didn't fear that she was a flight risk, and eventually bail was posted by her father for $5,000. But everyone was sympathetic to her story. But it all seemed a little bit odd to me because she had just killed a man and was facing first-degree murder charges.
Yeah, like if you're going to stay by the letter of the law, she should have been incarcerated awaiting trial.
Yeah.
But I guess if she was out on bail.
That happened days later.
Oh, that is interesting.
Very interesting, but I do think it speaks to the sympathetic nature that people around her had for her plight. And sadly, I think it speaks to that they knew that she was being abused. On March 25th, still in a drugged and dazed state, Jane was interviewed again and told police that Alan had been the one to pull the trigger.
What?
Yeah. She would later claim full responsibility, and most people believe that she made this claim because she was loaded up on Valium. But it does seem questionable given that she would get out of jail if Alan had done it.
Yeah, that was a dirtbag move by trying to blame it on her son.
But she had had a couple of days to go over and think through what she was going to confess to the police. And that is what she confessed, is that Alan had done it.
Never in my mind would I feel like, oh, that's a option to blame it on my children.
Right. Had she actually confused the issue? Because she was on so much medication during this time and truly didn't remember pulling the trigger herself, but remembered Alan holding the gun.
No, I don't think so, or else she wouldn't have recanted so quickly. If that's the way that her brain had painted the story for her, she wouldn't have recanted right away. She knew it was wrong.
And so maybe she planned to confuse the issue in the courts and introduce reasonable doubt between which one had actually done it. And I don't know if she did it on purpose, but this is what she did.
But that's gambling with your son's future, and that's not okay.
No. Her story of Alan being the one to pull the trigger was a little harder to take back in reality than just to simply say that she had lied and apologized for lying. On March 26, both she and Alan were arraigned and placed in a jail cell in Queens County Jail in Liverpool. And eventually Alan is let out.
Oh, good. Because he didn't know that she was going to shoot him.
I think he probably had a pretty good guess of what was going to happen.
Do you think so?
Yeah, and he did help cover it up afterwards.
He did help cover it up, but like you said, when he brought out the rifle, he probably didn't think too much about it because he was always told to go fetch the rifle. Hard to say.
Jane obtained a lawyer who arranged for a psychological assessment to be done. Her lawyer attempted to enter a guilty plea of manslaughter, but the provincial attorney wouldn't accept it. Billy had been asleep when she shot him. The prosecuting attorney was not local and had never met Billy. He was determined to see that Jane was brought to justice because, regardless of the type of person that Billy had been, a human life had been taken. In Canada, there are some key differences between the two charges when it comes to sentencing. Manslaughter allows a judge to determine an appropriate sentence based on the crime. First and second degree murder, though, have minimums that must be met for sentencing.
And rightfully so.
They're more serious offenses. What she had done was pretty horrific.
Yeah, she still murdered someone in their sleep.
Had Jane lied during her confession and told police that Billy was awake and threatening her, like he always had done, the charge would have been manslaughter. And interestingly, death usually comes to a battered woman after one beating too many, one punch or one kick that's went over the edge. Often, though, the husband pleads guilty to manslaughter or second-degree murder, and the court accepts those pleas.
Because I was just meaning to kick the crap out of her. I wasn't meaning to kill her.
That's right.
Oh.
The trial began on November 2nd and lasted 18 days in front of what was supposed to be a 12-member jury. The jury actually proceeded with 11 jurors because one member stepped down because they knew Jane, and they were never actually replaced.
That's weird.
It was such an odd thing to happen during a trial.
Yeah.
The prosecution pled their case. Jane had no right to kill Billy just because she was having a rough go.
A rough go.
They laid out the murder as being planned and deliberate and meeting all the requirements for a first-degree murder charge.
First degree. Yeah, I don't know how I feel about that. I don't think she was any different than as if he had kidnapped a stranger off the street and held her hostage and abused her.
But at the time of the killing, he was sound asleep. She had had the forethought to get Alan to go and get the gun. And then the way that she covered up was pretty meticulous.
That's true.
And the prosecutor had the knowledge that she had sought to kill him before. The person that she had approached to kill him as a hired hit had come forward.
Yeah, that's not looking good then.
No.
It's so tough in a case like this because we sympathize with Jane and we can understand how she felt that she had no other option, no other way out. I can't find one redeeming quality about Billy. But at the same time, a life is a life, and she did commit murder.
Yes.
Which just makes this so tragic.
It was a dirtbag decision. But I can also sympathize that she didn't feel like she had any other decision to make.
Yeah. And he probably would have ended up killing her or one of her children.
In Jane's original statement to the police, the officer failed to record Jane's recounts of the abuse that she had suffered at Billy's hands.
What?
He felt it wasn't really pertinent to the case at the time.
That is the case.
That is so true. It is the case. But because the abuse was excluded from the statement, Jane's lawyer argued that it wasn't her complete confession and therefore shouldn't be allowed to be entered. Like, they actually redacted all the parts where she was telling them why she had killed him and why she felt fearful and why even when he was sleeping, she still felt threatened.
So they just doctored it up and edited it to make it sound like she was just a cold-blooded, vicious killer.
Well, I don't think that they did it on purpose. The guy actually felt that, yeah, this is just a wife complaining about her situation in life and didn't really have any influence on her actions. That was just something that happened to wives.
Okay, buddy, and you're above the law and you get to make those decisions? I think not.
Yeah, but that's what happened. Luckily, her lawyer argued it in court and that confession wasn't allowed to be entered.
Good.
If it had been allowed, Jane's confession would have seemed more like she was just this heartless person without an explanation of why she felt threatened by Billy even when he was passed out. Witness after witness testified to the abuse Jane had suffered at Billy's hands and his explosive temper. There were some that testified that Jane was overly dramatic and didn't have it that bad after all. And among those was Margaret.
Margaret? The neighbor?
Yes, she was totally ticked off that Jane had pulled her into having to testify.
Margaret. That shocked me.
It shocked Jane too. She was deeply betrayed by this.
Totally. She didn't have it that bad?
Yeah.
Did you have to walk around with a pipe up your butt, Margaret? No.
And part of the reason that Jane acted that night was to protect Margaret. She felt that Billy was going to set their house on fire.
He told her that he was going to. Yeah, that's not okay, Margaret.
When Jane took the stand, she told the court about her childhood, that she had learned that women had to accept the physical abuse from their drunk husbands, how she had never fought back when Billy abused her because he made her believe that it was her fault. She had learned that any time she complained, the abuse got worse. A common punishment was being forced to drink a glass of Billy's own urine. She outlined her thought process when asked why she didn't leave Billy. She said she was fearful that he would make good on his threats to kill everyone she loved.
And he probably would have. He would shoot guns at her head just for fun.
Mm-hmm. The prosecution made the argument that despite Jane's sad story, that she had still committed first-degree murder. In their argument, they said, "We may sympathize with Jane Stafford in her situation, but the law is the law. And I would submit that in this case, we have to say we sympathize, but what you did was planned and deliberate, was not provoked, and was first-degree murder."
But at the same time, as police officers, we weren't there to help you. We were running away from your husband, letting him be a total tyrant to you. So we left you with not very many options.
Mm-hmm. Before the decision of Jane's guilt was decided by the jury, the judge gave them instructions that took 7.5 hours to relay to them.
The instructions took 7.5 hours?
Saying to the jury that they had to determine if, quote, the killing of Mr. Stafford was objectively or actually a matter of necessity. So you must look at the means employed in self-defense and decide whether those means were necessary. In addressing that question, of course, you may take into account what you know about the character and disposition of Mr. Stafford. You should understand that the law of self-defense proceeds from necessity, from the instinctive and the intuitive necessity to preserve oneself. Under no circumstances may that defense be raised as a cloak for retaliation or revenge. The use of force in self-defense should come as a matter of last resort. It's justified only where there are no other reasonable means to prevent the assault. If you have any reasonable doubt as to whether the accused acted in self-defense, as I have defined it, you will find the accused not guilty of murder because a homicide committed in self-defense is not a culpable homicide. He told the jury it could return one of 4 verdicts: guilty of first-degree murder, guilty of second-degree murder, guilty of manslaughter, or not guilty. He explained in detail how each verdict could be reached, and it was 5:30 p.m. when he completed his charge.
That's wild. So to put that into perspective, listeners, imagine listening to 7 of our episodes back to back, and that was just us reading the instructions.
Yeah.
That's crazy. But you know, with his statement there, it's making me feel even more so with the terms that he's given to them that this was self-defense.
Mm-hmm. When Jane left for court that morning, she had said her goodbyes to her sons and family and had made arrangements for their care. She had kept her bag packed for jail since day 1 of the trial. She fully anticipated going to jail. The jury took 17.5 hours to deliberate.
Oh, I bet.
The next day, on Saturday at 11:30 a.m., the jury announced it had reached a verdict. The verdict they returned was not guilty.
Not guilty at all?
Nope. Later in an interview, juror Daniel Smart said, as an explanation for their decision, that the jurors found the Stafford case to be very emotional. When she was on the stand, it was hard to sit and listen to, because she said things that people shouldn't have had to say to other people. I was relieved when it was over, and I felt we came to the best decision that we could. Did she plan to murder him? That was the question. First-degree murder. There was no way it was proved to us that she actually planned it. There was no way we could come to that decision without any doubts at all.
Wow. I was not expecting that. I was thinking maybe manslaughter. I was not expecting her to be not guilty.
Which, does it seem right?
Well, I was excited about it, but I don't know if that's right or wrong.
Yeah, she did kill somebody.
She did, but I don't think she was in her right mind. Did she have a way out? No.
Jane was free to leave the courtroom that day. While her lawyer told her to try and get on with her life as best she could, he also made her aware that an appeal in this case was very likely. On December 2nd, 2 weeks after the verdict, Jane left the province.
I was just going to say I'd be heading to Mexico.
Jane left the province with Alan and Darren to try and start over. But adjusting was hard, and the move wouldn't be permanent. Papers for an appeal were served on December 15th, 1982.
Oh, and that would just be sickening to get. Like, knowing I have to go through this again.
And when she was on the trial, she didn't spare any details about the abuse that she had went through.
Nor should she have to, but that would be hard to do.
It would be like reliving it again. There were a lot of people that didn't agree with the decision that was made by the jury. It was argued that the trial had put the victim's character on trial instead of the confessed killer.
But in a self-defense case, you have to do that. You have to look at why they're doing it to prove if it's self-defense or not.
Yep. It was clear that Jane was a victim and that her options to flee her abusive relationship were very limited, especially when her psyche was taken into account. But the argument made by the prosecution after the trial that those factors would normally relate to the severity of her sentence, not to the establishing of the crime she committed and her guilt over it. It was argued that if Jane could get away with murder, then it would be a slippery slope into vigilante justice for an abuse victim.
That is true. It does set a precedence. I'm so torn.
Yeah. And there were several cases of women killing their abusive husbands right after this verdict.
Really? Oh, yeah, that's not so good.
No. The appeal was granted and a new trial date was set for February 14th, 1983. While Jane awaited the trial to determine her fate again, she used the time to upgrade her education and prepare to go into a career as a nurse's assistant. This time, when Jane's lawyer offered a deal of manslaughter, the prosecution accepted it. So they didn't want to go through the trial again.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to either.
No.
And she had mentally prepared herself to go to jail. Like, she thought she was going to get a sentence.
Because she knew what she did was wrong.
Yes. That's why I was expecting more like manslaughter, right?
So that ends up being what she actually was convicted of.
And that seems more appropriate to me.
It does. At the sentencing hearing, Mr. Justice Nunn said that Jane had lived a tragic life and that Billy Stafford had been a man on the outer fringes of the definition of humanity, but a human nonetheless. He said that he did not subscribe to Staff Sergeant Peter Williamson's view that Jane should receive a medal for what she had done. He said that Jane had been judge, jury, and executioner. The judge recognized Jane's efforts to make something of her life, and he didn't believe that she was a danger to society, but emphasized that there must be some deterrence in the law and a protection for society as a whole. Wives don't have the right to take the lives of their husbands. He sentenced Jane to 6 months in jail, with 2 years probation, with a recommendation that she be allowed to commute from jail to attend her classes to complete her nursing courses. And I thought this sentence to me was more of a good compromise between the law being for justice and those that were pleading for mercy.
For sure. While you were saying that, though, what came to my mind was, yes, women are not allowed to murder their husbands, but why are there not stricter laws and penalties about men battering their wives?
Yes.
Men are allowed to kick and punch and threaten and maim, even to their little children, punch their little 3-year-old's teeth out, and that's okay. And he's not going to spend 1 day in jail for that. But it comes down on the wife when she feels so cornered that she has to lash out like that. And it's not okay, but it just seems like there's a bit of a double standard there.
And there was. I mean, we're making progress in that area, but at that time, definitely, there was a double standard. While in prison, Jane continued attending her nursing courses and during her psych rotation learned about sociopathic personality disturbances. She felt that Billy had displayed all of them.
Me too, girl. Me too. That's what I said right at the beginning. He sounds like a sociopath.
Yeah. Learning this gave her some peace because she felt like she understood a little bit more of what Billy had been and why he had done the things that he had done. It wasn't her fault that he acted the way he did, like he had always told her.
Oh, for sure.
On April 14, 1984, Jane Stafford was eligible for parole after serving 1/3 of her sentence, and it was granted. In June of that same year, at 35 years old, Jane graduated as a fully qualified nursing assistant, a job she truly enjoyed. In the years following her release, she was the subject of a CBC Fifth Estate documentary and a book, both titled Life with Billy. She began speaking in women's groups, gradually gaining confidence and self-esteem. She worked with shelters for abused women and supported many that fled their partners. She would sit with women that had left their relationships. In these meetings, they would share their stories, and Jane would try to empower women to see themselves as a person that didn't deserve to be abused.
That's amazing.
That she was able to turn the horrific things that she had suffered into something positive for somebody else.
Yeah, and to help other people. And it shows, too, that she wasn't this crazy,
bloodthirsty, revengeful person.
No, she served her time. She made good use of her time, getting an education while she was incarcerated, and then is going on to try and help other people. She never wanted to hurt anybody.
No, she really did feel like she had no other choice. In an interview, she said, "I can look back now on it all, 3 years later, and I can say I'm sorry it ended the way it did, because no one has the right to take another person's life no matter what. But I will never be sorry that Stafford is dead. In my community, everyone knew I was being abused, yet no one acknowledged that fact. No one spoke about it out loud. Battering isn't the taboo, talking about it is." She lobbied for support for other battered women, support for them immediately when they left, and support through the court system. The support and lobbying came at a personal sacrifice for Jane. Each time she spoke at a public engagement or met one-on-one with another woman, Jane had to relive her own trauma over and over again. Jane told some of her friends that listening to the stories of other abused women was almost like living with Billy again.
That would be really tough.
Mm-hmm.
And I really agree with her statement about how it wasn't the abuse that was taboo, it was talking about it that was taboo.
Yeah.
Like, that's so backwards.
That will allow it to go on and will actually protect it to go on.
Right. And I think that's why it's so important that our province has this domestic violence awareness month so that it's not taboo to talk about.
No, that we ask questions about it and we recognize that it still does happen.
Right. And try to get women out of those situations before it escalates to something like this happening.
Yeah. But meeting with all these women and being a voice for women did cause Jane to go in and out of depressive states, often contemplating suicide. She had escaped Billy's tyranny, but really she hadn't escaped the abuse and the emotional toll that had taken on her. At this time, she started shoplifting more frequently. Therapists describe her kleptomania as a symptom of her inner turmoil. This compulsion to steal things that she didn't need or things that she could have easily paid for was a huge embarrassment to Jane. She felt shameful and hated herself for continuing to put her family in the newspaper headlines again and again. She felt guilty all the time. She felt guilty for shoplifting. She felt guilty about any of the speaking engagements she would turn down in an effort to care for herself. And she felt like she was still carrying the guilt of Billy's death. She felt like she wore a sign over her head that said, "You're a murderer."
Wow. I can see how the theft would be a way for her to even subconsciously trying to fill that void that she's still feeling.
Or any time that she would experience happiness, she wouldn't really feel like she deserved it.
That's a heavy load to carry around, all those things that you just described.
Yeah. One therapist that Jane sought out said that Billy's hold on Jane, even after his death, was not surprising. Sleep deprivation and the emotional abuse, strengthened by the unpredictable outbursts of physical violence and degrading sexual episodes, were a form of severe brainwash that left Jane broken and confused.
Mm-hmm.
Jane also struggled again to trust other men and to have meaningful relationships with them. She had some male friends, but couldn't really bring herself to trust them completely for a very long time.
That would feel almost impossible, honestly. I don't know if I could ever trust another man after living through that.
Yeah. With therapy, though, she was able to find some balance in her life, and Jane did find love again and married a man named Joel on October 10th, 1991. And that's where the story should end.
Please tell me he was not abusive.
No, he wasn't abusive.
Oh, I couldn't have taken it.
But life wasn't done for Jane yet. Not everyone was supportive of her lobbying against family violence and spousal abuse.
What?
The culture at the time was different than ours today. Not saying now that we have domestic violence figured out, but there has been some progress since the 80s and early 90s when Jane took her voice to the public.
Which speaks to how brave she really was at the time.
Mm-hmm. Just to give you an idea of the feelings at the time, on August 13th, 1985, a meeting of the Queens County Council, 6 of 11 councillors voted against providing a $6,400 grant for a proposed transition house to aid battered women in Queens County and the adjoining counties. 2 male councillors were particularly vocal in their opposition.
And I hope you tell us their names because they deserve to be embarrassed for what they said.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly why I did include their names. Councillor Joe Rogers said he couldn't see the need for such a facility and that shelters became vacation spots for some women and enticed them away from their homes and their families.
Oh, I'm fuming.
And Councillor Laurie Smith said that women bring on their own troubles. He added that what some women need today is a good kick in the backside.
He didn't.
He did.
We're talking about battered women who need to flee situations like this so that they don't have to murder their husbands. And he's saying they need to be treated with violence to smarten them up.
Yeah, that they shouldn't be looking for a vacation spot.
I have never wanted to take 2 heads and clank them together as hard as I possibly could as I do these 2 dirt bags
that
right
made
now.
These statements.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the general feeling in private lives was much worse than this.
That's so terrible. And honestly, they're politicians. They were probably putting it as nicely as they could. That probably wasn't even what they really wanted to say.
No, politicians are usually guarded when they speak in public. And these were the statements they were making publicly.
Oh, I hope they got their just comeuppance one day.
Oh, well, the public was a little bit outraged at what they had said. But this was the environment that Jane was speaking out in. Jane began to receive threatening notes and phone calls, messages that told her to shut her mouth or else it would be shut permanently. The threats came at all different times with no real pattern. Some even came to her parents' house when she was just there on a visit. Once the lug nuts on her tires were mysteriously loosened, her fear sent her looking for a gun to protect herself.
That is despicable. I cannot even believe that people would respond to a woman this way.
As Jane prepared for her first Christmas with her new husband, stress was at an all-time high for her. Between the speaking engagements, her work at the shelters, dealing with her court dates for her kleptomania, and the threats, Jane was having difficulty coping. She became more despondent and her personality became more bizarre and unusual for Jane. She started to talk more and more to a close friend about suicide and even made a pact with this friend who was also suicidal. They agreed to let each other know at least 3 weeks before they planned to do anything. That way they could make sure that the other had a chance to talk things over with the other one. Her fear about the threats even played into Jane's suicidal thoughts. She started to tell people that she believed that whoever was sending the threats would try to make it look like a suicide. One good friend questioned her if she had made up these threats as a plan to cover up her own suicide.
No.
So she had always had suicidal thoughts.
Right.
And these thoughts were coming more frequently at the same time that she was receiving all of these threats. So a friend actually thought that she was sending the threats to herself to make it look like she was setting herself up for somebody to murder her.
So that she could commit suicide and make it look like it was murder.
Yeah, which seems pretty harsh, but Jane in the past had come up with some pretty elaborate storylines for her planned suicides. Some were about being mugged. Some were covered up by a reason saying that she had terminal cancer, which she didn't. And there was even one about having to help another woman commit suicide, but needing a friend to get rid of the gun afterwards to make it look like a murder. Remember, that's how Billy's death had been deemed a homicide. Because they didn't find the gun, they thought it was a murder.
Right.
Jane denied that she was involved in any of the threats.
I don't think she was.
I think that she did receive threats, and then maybe it evolved from there.
If a politician is making that kind of public statement, what are the other dirtbags doing?
On Friday, February 21st, 1992, Jane was getting ready to go to work for her midnight shift. She always worked nights because she had difficulty sleeping because of her nightmares. That day, she had been busy picking up a gift for a resident and making plans with friends and sending James, her middle son, who was now living with her, off with Alan so that he could take him to his dad's for the weekend. When those boys left, they didn't really notice anything different about their mom. It's not like she gave them a special goodbye or anything like that. As she left for work around 8 p.m., she told Darren and James' girlfriend, who was staying with Darren to kind of watch over him, that she was going into work early to pick up a cake to go along with the birthday gift. And then she was going out to meet with a woman from a shelter before going to work. She promised to call at the beginning of her shift, as she usually did. Jane was last seen at the Micmac shortly before 8 p.m., where she had purchased a birthday cake. Her work reported her missing to the police at 1 p.m. It was unusual for Jane not to show up for her shift. Her family was contacted, and gradually they gathered at her house. While they contacted family and friends and asked about Jane's whereabouts, they received 3 hang-up calls. And this was suspicious enough to the police at the time that they actually started to trace the calls that were coming into her line. But then they didn't receive any calls after that. Jane's body was found the next day in a parking lot. Her body was slumped toward the passenger seat from her seated position in the driver's seat. Around the car, there was no evidence of footprints or tire tracks within 4 feet of the car. Only the front passenger door was locked, and the keys were still in the ignition. In the left pocket of her jacket, police found a sealed envelope. The letter inside the envelope was stenciled and read, "No more talk from you, gotcha."
That's a little bizarre.
There were no signs of struggle in the car, and the gun that had killed Jane had been wrapped in a sheet and was found in her lap when her body was moved. Along with the gun, police found a half-filled cup of coffee and 3 plastic grocery bags nestled one inside the other. Inside of them, there was another plastic bag and a sandwich bag with 3 .38 caliber bullets. In the back seat, they found a loaf of bread and a box cake.
Which, to me, if you actually stopped to pick up that birthday cake, that doesn't imply to me that you were going to kill yourself.
No, there's a lot of things that she did that made it look like she wasn't going to kill herself.
Well, and even how did the gun get wrapped up after she had shot herself with it?
Well,
isn't that what you said? It was wrapped up on her lap?
Mm-hmm.
And she died of gunshot wound.
Yep.
So you can't wrap up a gun after you've killed yourself with it.
But you could wrap up a gun before and shoot through the blankets.
Was there evidence of that?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, never mind then.
The medical examiner confirmed that the bullet track was conducive to Jane having shot herself, but the official report did state that homicide could not be ruled out. Her fingerprints or any other fingerprints were never found on the gun. There was heated debates on both sides as to what had led to Jane's death. Some argued that the threats were real and that in previous suicide attempts, not long before this one, Jane had tied up all loose ends, making sure to say goodbye to everyone, going to a motel, and had this big elaborate plan of how she was going to commit suicide. They argued that Jane was working on her problems and that the ones that she faced currently were smaller than any of the ones that she had faced in the past. And so they couldn't really understand why at this point in her life that she would commit suicide when she had already been through so much.
I think it's an accumulation, though.
Yeah.
It's piling on top of. It's not this is separate, this is separate. It's adding one more thing onto that.
That's right. Jane had made plans to take her parents to medical appointments, and she'd made date nights with her friends, too. And during her previous suicide attempt, she had actually canceled all of her appointments with her friends. Others argued that Jane had been suicidal for a while and believed that the threats were an elaborate way to try and make her death look like a homicide in order to cash in on insurance policies. They cited upcoming dates as huge stressors for Jane. The Canadian Panel of Violence Against Women and the court appearances for shoplifting were both weighing heavily on Jane's mind. Jane had left provisions and goodbyes behind for her family in recorded messages. But in the messages, she said that she was fearful of the threats that were being made against her, and that was the reason she felt that she needed to be prepared for anything. Jane had been seen with $1,000 cash in the days before the murder, and this was the exact amount of money that she had offered a friend to clean up the gun from another friend's death.
Oh, that's interesting.
The cinching evidence for me for deciding which theory I believed came from Jane's camisole that she had been wearing underneath her sweater the day she was shot. It didn't have a bullet hole in it, even though her coat and her sweater did. The coroner surmised that this was because there was a button that would have pushed against the gun as it was placed against Jane's chest. Jane would have been the only one to have felt the button and move the gun aside and push it through the buttonholes instead of over top the button.
So the idea is that she felt it hit the button, like the button pressed into her chest, so she moved it out of the way.
That's right.
And then, so she shot herself in the chest, is what they're implying.
Yeah, which is not a common way to commit suicide.
No, especially for a woman. So you think she did commit suicide?
I think that it would have been a really fluky thing to happen for the camisole just to happen to be moved aside when the shot entered her body.
I'm not sure. I have to digest that for a minute.
But there's a lot of things that point in the other direction as well. On June 8, 1992, 3.5 months after her death, the Halifax police did close the file on the potential murder case, concluding that she had committed suicide. Despite the ruling, there are many that still believe that Jane was killed to silence her voice against domestic violence. Even in her death, Jane's words still remain true today. Society needs to be educated and made more aware that domestic violence is an unacceptable criminal behavior, punishable by the law. My purpose in speaking out is to tell other battered women not to be silent screamers. Do not keep it behind closed doors. Come out and be heard. The more that come forward and speak out, the sooner society's attitudes will change and there will be an end to this cycle of violence. Publicly tell your story, no matter how shocking or unbelievable it may sound.
Wow, that's remarkable. What a statement.
And that is the tragic, emotion-filled case of Jane Hurshman, dirtbag or not.
Wow, what a wild ride, Melissa. I'm not convinced. I don't know if she committed suicide or not. I'd like to hope that she didn't, but maybe if she did, trying to stage it as a murder was maybe so that her sons wouldn't think she gave up on them, to kind of alleviate that. But then at the same time, would they not be hurt by thinking she was murdered either? I don't know. That's a tough one.
I think a lot of her actions seem really contradictory that day to either committing suicide or to being murdered.
Like, why pick up the cake and have it sitting in your back seat if you were going to not even bring it there?
Right. But if you were trying to sell the story that it was murder, then having the cake in your back seat would make that a more plausible way to think about her death.
That's true. And I think the note being like sealed in an envelope in her pocket, that's weird. Because if you're a murderer and you're wanting to leave that note, you would just like fling it on top of the body or just on the dashboard or whatever. You wouldn't take the time to put it in her pocket.
No.
Unless they had left it for her to find and then she got in her car and she had put it in her pocket. I have so many questions.
And so many questions remain unanswered. Like, I find it very suspicious too that the only door that was locked was the passenger door. So that to me would tell me that somebody's been in and out and locked it on their way out just out of habit.
Yeah, maybe. Because the other 3 doors were all unlocked. And there was no gunshot residue on her hands because it was wrapped in the towel. But that could have been the murderer too, to not leave fingerprints.
Yep. But I think that there's enough documented evidence of her suicide attempts before and the messages that she left after for her new husband and for her family leave too much for reasonable doubt to say that somebody else murdered her.
Right. And they never found any evidence to indicate a murderer.
No. The women that she went to meet, they could never find that woman.
No one came forward and said, I'm the one she was supposed to meet.
No.
Huh.
Which again, you could argue both sides for.
Yeah. Wow, that was devastating. And
Yeah.
I don't know if we can even really call her a dirtbag.
No, I'm not sure we can either. I think we can't condone her actions in killing Billy, but we can completely understand them. She was a woman pushed to the limits, and as a result, there was a dirtbag decision made about taking another human life.
Yeah, I believe it was a dirtbag decision, but I don't believe she's a dirtbag.
I think she struggled a lot with a lot of different issues. And one of the most depressing things that I did find about this case was reading the reports of so many women that came forward to say that they had suffered just like Jane. Her case is so extreme and so hard to imagine that that would happen over and over and over again to different women.
Yeah, this should be the 1 in a million, not the norm.
Right.
It's such a sad story, but one that needs to be heard. And we need to be more aware that this is happening. This is happening around us still.
But I think Jane's last statement that I shared with you is totally accurate in that more awareness has to come about. This week, give some thought to family violence.
And hopefully we can all find a way to do our part in helping to prevent that and to help those who are in need.
And to speak out.
Absolutely. Like Jane said, your voice deserves to be heard.
And with that, we'll leave you for another week when Christy brings us another case.
But until then, have a great week.
See ya.
Bye. Hey, listeners. Oh, wait. No.
Welcome back to Varied Motives.
I'm just ready to go. I'm excited to hear this case. Your face. You're like, oh. It's okay. There's this thing called editing. It's beautiful. Our knight in shining armor.
Yeah.
Melissa's husband's dropping us off lunch. Oh, man. I haven't had a deep fried pickle in a hot minute. Probably since last time we went out together. I got, your GST benefit is available. Reply yes to receive your benefit.
Ooh, click that one, Christy. Okay, where were we?
I don't know. I'm just focusing on deep fried pickles.
Woohoo! Okay, daddy issues, right?
Yeah.
Protruding eyes and thick lips.
Yeah. All the better to kiss you with, my dear. Tell me about murder, Melissa. Tell me.
Sleep deprivation and the interminable.
The what?
Interminable, emotional.
Interminable and emotional.
I'm going to just cut that word out.
Guaranteed that little dirtbag is at home battering his own wife.
Okay, and we're done for the week. Bye.
Yeah.
Another Sound Off Media Company podcast.